The joke that froze the room: the club did not advertise its true purpose on the outside. From the street, it looked like any other after-hours lounge in mid-century Las Vegas. Low amber lights glowing behind smoked glass. The soft silhouette of cigarette smoke drifting like ghosts behind half-drawn curtains. The faint promise of music leaking into the desert night. But everyone who mattered knew what it really was. This was where business was finished. Where power relaxed. Where men who owned pieces of the city came not to be seen but to remind each other who they were. The velvet ropes were not there to keep people out. They were there to mark the boundary between ordinary life and a world where reputations were currencies and words could weigh more than weapons. Dean Martin did not come often. When he did, it was usually quietly. No entourage, no announcement, no need. His name alone was a passport in any room in America. On stage, he was laughter in velvet. A glass tilted just enough to suggest indulgence, never enough to betray control. A voice that made sorrow sound like romance and romance sound like home. But offstage, Dean was something else. Softer, more reserved, almost invisible when he wished to be. Fame had taught him that the loudest presence in a room was rarely the strongest one. That night, he had been invited by someone he respected, a studio financier who owed him a favor and wanted to repay it with a quiet drink and better company than usual. Dean almost declined. He had finished a long run of shows, his voice still carrying the echo of brass and applause. He wanted to go home, to sit somewhere without smoke in the air and eyes on his back. But something in the man's voice, not excitement, not pressure, but caution, had made him curious. So he went. Inside, the club hummed with a different frequency than the casinos. No clanging machines. No tourists laughing too loudly. Just the slow, deliberate rhythm of men who were used to being obeyed. Leather booths curved like half-moons around polished tables. Waiters moved without asking questions. Every face wore a version of confidence, some real, some rehearsed. At the far end of the room, beneath a chandelier shaped like a frozen burst of stars, sat a table that subtly rearranged the atmosphere around it. Conversations bent away from it. Glances lingered, then disappeared. The men there did not need to raise their voices. Their silence already carried weight. Dean felt it before he saw it. Salvatore Moretti sat at the center of that table. The newspapers never used his name. They preferred phrases like sources close to the investigation or an unidentified businessman. In certain neighborhoods, he was called a benefactor. In others, a shadow. To those who worked for him, he was simply Mr. S. He had built his power the way old cities were built. Quietly, brick by brick, favor by favor, mistake by mistake. He dressed with the elegance of someone who no longer needed to impress anyone. Dark suit, white shirt, no tie. His hair was silver at the temples, black elsewhere. Like time itself had negotiated only partial access. When Dean entered, conversations softened. Not because of fear, because of recognition. Even men who commanded rooms understood when a different kind of presence arrived. The kind that came not from control, but from connection. Dean Martin belonged to the public. 2 soldiers overseas, 2 women dancing in kitchens. 2 men sitting alone with the radio on at midnight. His voice lived in places power could not reach. Moretti noticed him immediately. He did not smile. He observed the financier guided Dean toward an open booth near the center. It's close enough to the chandelier to be seen, far enough from Moretti's table to pretend it was coincidence. Drinks appeared without being ordered. A soft piano track began somewhere behind the bar, as if the room itself were clearing its throat. For a while, nothing happened. Dean spoke quietly with the men at his table. They talked about work, about schedules, about how the city was changing. Dean listened more than he spoke. He always had. He laughed at the right moments, but his eyes kept drifting, not to Moretti himself, but to the effect his presence had on the room. How men leaned slightly inward when speaking to him. How a waiter hesitated half a second longer before setting down a glass. How even confidence took on a careful edge. Then it happened. Moretti stood, not abruptly, Not to make a show. He rose the way a man rises when he expects the world to pause for him. And it did. The chairs stopped shifting. A laugh cut off mid-breath. Even the piano seemed to retreat, its melody thinning. As if making space, Moretti lifted his glass slightly, not in a toast, but in acknowledgement. His eyes found Dean's. "Dean Martin," he said, his voice smooth, conversational, carrying easily through the room without needing volume. "Didn't expect to see you in a place like this." Dean inclined his head politely. "Seems like a place with good whiskey," he replied. "I've been known to make poor decisions in its presence." A few men chuckled. The tension did not leave. It simply shifted. Moretti smiled then, but it did not reach his eyes. "You make a living off charm," he said. "It suits you." He took a small sip, then let the glass rest against his palm. "I hear a lot about you," he continued. "Funny thing is, nobody talks about where you come from. They talk about the lights, the records, the suits, not the beginning." The word beginning landed heavier than it should have. Dean felt it. The subtle tightening in the room, the instinctive stillness that comes when people sense a line approaching. "I suppose beginnings aren't as entertaining," Dean said evenly. "They usually don't sing very well." Moretti's smile sharpened. "On the contrary, beginnings explain everything." He turned slightly, addressing not just Dean now, but the room. "You know, my father used to say, you can tell the worth of a man by the family that made him, the blood that raised him, the house he came out of." A few nods, a few unreadable expressions. Moretti's eyes returned to Dean. "I did some asking," he said. "Out of curiosity? Not business. Just interest. I wanted to know what kind of soil grows a voice like yours." Dean did not move. His hands rested loosely near his glass. But something in his chest grew very still. "And?" Dean asked. Moretti tilted his head. "Let's just say, it wasn't the sort of garden most men here would boast about." A murmur rippled. Not loud, but present. Moretti took another sip, unhurried. "A father who struggled. A mother who carried more than she should have. A house where the walls were thin and the future thinner." He paused, letting the images assemble themselves. "Not exactly the stuff legends are made of."
Daddy.
He smiled again, this time wider. "Makes you wonder," he said lightly, "whether the polish came from effort or from running." The room froze. This was not an insult disguised as humor. It was a boundary test. A reminder that power, when bored, often amuses itself by pressing on other people's foundations. Every man there understood what had just happened. Moretti had not attacked Dean's fame. He had not challenged his success. He had reached for something older, private, untouchable. Family. The financier beside Dean stiffened. Someone further back muttered something that was not quite a word. A waiter stopped mid-step. Dean's eyes lowered briefly to his glass. In that pause lived 1,000 possible reactions. A joke sharpened into a weapon. A warning, sweetened with laughter. A quiet insult in return? Even anger. Not loud, but edged enough to ripple outward. But Dean did not choose any of them. He breathed slowly. Then he lifted his eyes to Moretti, and when he spoke, his voice did not change. "I think," Dean said gently, "my parents would be very surprised to hear themselves described as soil." A few men blinked. "They were people," he continued. "Tired people. Hopeful people. People who didn't always know how to win, but never forgot how to work. My father used to come home with his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold his fork. My mother used to stay up after everyone slept, sewing, because threading was cheaper than tomorrow." The room did not move. "They didn't give me polish," Dean said. "They gave me direction. They taught me how to stand in a room without needing to own it. How to listen before speaking. How to leave places better than I found them, even if all I could leave was respect." He paused, not for effect, but because memory had weight. "You're right about one thing," he said. "I did run. I ran toward the stage because they were warm. I ran toward music because it didn't ask where I came from. But every time I opened my mouth to sing, It was their voices that taught me how. He looked at Moretti, not hard, not soft, but clear. So if the question is whether my family belongs in this room, Dean finished, I'd say they already are. Every time someone here remembers the sound of home, silence. Followed not the uneasy kind, the kind that arrives when something unexpected has just been placed on the table and no one knows which hand should touch it first. Moretti did not speak immediately. His glass hovered near his lips, forgotten. His eyes searched Dean's face, not for anger now, but for weakness. He did not find it. Around them, men who had come expecting entertainment found themselves confronted with something far less comfortable. Dignity, the piano resumed. Tentatively, as if asking permission, Moretti lowered his glass. "Well," he said slowly, "that's one way to answer." Dean nodded once. "It's the only one I have." A few breaths passed, then, unexpectedly, someone at the far end of the room began to clap once, twice, not loudly, not as applause. As acknowledgement, it stopped almost as soon as it began, but it had already done its work. Something in the atmosphere shifted. Moretti studied Dean a moment longer and inclined his head just slightly. "Enjoy your drink, Mr. Martin," he said. He sat. Conversation gradually returned, but it did not return to where it had been. The air felt rearranged, as if furniture inside people's minds had been moved without asking. At Dean's table, no one spoke for a long moment. The financier finally exhaled. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured. Dean picked up his glass, not to drink, but to feel its coolness. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did," because he knew something the room did not yet understand. Men like Moretti rarely tested boundaries for sport. They tested them to see what lay behind, and what Dean had just shown was not submission, nor defiance. It was something far more dangerous, a man who could not be purchased with fear. And somewhere behind Moretti's composed expression, a calculation had already begun, because calm, when it cannot be controlled, becomes a problem. And problems in that world never remained polite for long. Dean did not leave the club immediately. That alone unsettled people. Most men, after a moment like that, either basked in it or escaped it. They rode the echo of their own words into louder rooms, or they disappeared into the night before consequences had time to catch up. Dean did neither. He stayed where he was, seated beneath the chandelier, his posture unchanged, his glass resting loosely between his fingers, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But the room had changed. The conversations that resumed did so at a lower altitude. Laughter returned, but thinner, more careful, like ice forming over deep water. Men who had not looked at Dean before now found reasons to glance his way, not with admiration, with measurement. He had crossed a line without raising his voice, and men who lived by lines took that seriously. From his table, Dean felt it, the invisible rearranging of attention. The subtle pull of gravity shifting in a room where gravity was usually owned. Moretti did not look at him again. That, somehow, was worse. The financier leaned closer. "We should go," he murmured. Dean shook his head slightly. "Not yet." The man swallowed. "Dean, you said what you said. You made your point. That's enough for one night." Dean's eyes followed the slow movement of a waiter refilling glasses at Moretti's table. "No," he said softly. "That was only the opening note." The financier did not ask what he meant. Some answers made rooms smaller. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Time stretched in a way only tense rooms know how to stretch minutes, behaving like questions instead of units. The piano players cycled through standards no one really listened to. Smoke drifted in patient layers. Dean finally lifted his glass and took a small sip, more out of courtesy than thirst. That was when the man appeared. He did not approach like an enforcer. He was not large, did not carry himself with the stiffness of someone trying to look dangerous. He wore a gray suit that blended easily into the room, hair neatly parted, face forgettable enough to be trusted, the kind of man who could stand beside you for an hour and leave without leaving a description behind. He stopped beside Dean's table. "Mr. Martin," he said politely. Dean looked up. Yes, Mr. Moretti would like a word. In private, the financier's hand tightened around his napkin. He's busy, he said quickly. We're just about to. Dean raised a finger, not at the messenger, but gently to the air. The financier fell silent. Dean stood. The room noticed chairs stilled again. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the piano faltered, a chord hanging incomplete before resolving itself nervously. Dean straightened his jacket. Lead the way. They did not go toward the back rooms everyone whispered about. They went upward. A narrow staircase behind a concealed door, carpeted in dark red, sound softening underfoot. The club's music thinned as they climbed, replaced by a quieter architecture, the low murmur of ventilation, the distant throb of the city, the subtle awareness of height. At the top, the man opened a door. The room beyond was smaller than expected, not lavish, not theatrical, just a private lounge with 2 chairs, a low table, and a wide window that overlooked the glittering sprawl of Las Vegas. The city lay below, like a field of electrical constellations, alive, busy, unaware. Moretti stood near the window. He did not turn immediately. For a moment, Dean saw only his reflection in the glass, a man outlined in neon and darkness, suspended between a world of applause and a world of consequences. The door closed quietly behind them. Sit, Moretti said. Dean did. Moretti turned. Up close, the man did not look like the myths. He looked older, not frail, but weathered. The kind of face that had been leaned into wind for decades, the kind that had learned to keep its true temperature private. You embarrassed me, Moretti said calmly. Dean nodded. That wasn't my intention, but it was the result. Yes, Moretti studied him. Most men, when they find themselves in a room like that, choose one of 2 masks. They either perform or they submit. You did neither, Dean did not answer. I asked about your family, Moretti continued, because men protect what defines them. It tells me where leverage lives. And what did you find? Dean asked. Moretti's mouth curved slightly. That you don't protect them the way most men do. Dean waited. You didn't threaten, Moretti said. You didn't deflect. You didn't joke it away. You placed them in the open, where they could be seen. That's not defense. That's ownership. Dean's gaze did not move. They don't belong to me, he said. I belong to them. Moretti exhaled slowly through his nose. See, he said, that answer right there is why you're in this room. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He pushed one toward Dean. Dean did not touch it. I didn't bring you up here to argue, Moretti said. I brought you because I'm interested. In what? In what kind of man refuses to shrink when shrinking would be safer? Dean looked at the city through the window. Maybe I've spent my life standing in front of people, he said. After a while, you learn there are worse things than being seen. Moretti lifted his glass, but did not drink. I don't believe in coincidence, he said. You didn't wander into my room tonight. You were invited into it by a man who knows exactly what kind of circles he was placing you near. Dean's eyes returned to him. Then perhaps you should ask him why. I already did, and said you were a man who doesn't owe his backbone to anyone. A brief silence. That kind of man, Moretti continued, is either very free or very dangerous. Dean smiled faintly. I've never felt particularly dangerous. No, Moretti agreed. You don't look it. He finally took a sip. Here's the truth, he said. Men come to me because they want something. Protection, permission, power. They bring gifts. They bring loyalty. They bring silence. You brought none of that. Dean waited. So I'm going to offer you something no one in that room will ever be offered, Moretti said. A chance to walk away from me. Dean tilted his head slightly. I didn't walk toward you. Moretti's eyes sharpened. That's not how my world works. He set the glass down. From this moment, whether you like it or not, you exist on my board. The question is whether you exist as a piece, or as a man passing by the table. Dean considered that. Then he stood. Not abruptly, not as defiance. Simply as a man standing when a conversation had reached its center. Then I suppose this is where I pass, Dean said. Moretti looked up at him. You're very certain. No, Dean replied. I'm very clear. He gestured faintly toward the window. That city out there is full of people who don't get to choose their boards. They don't get to choose who touches their lives. I sing to some of them. I drink with some of them. I come from them. If standing in rooms like yours costs me the right to walk freely among them, then it costs too much. Moretti watched him for a long time. You know, he said slowly, men who speak to me that way usually don't get the chance to do it twice. Dean met his gaze. Then tonight must be my first. A long silence stretched between them, dense but not hostile. Something older than threat moved through it. Recognition, perhaps. Or curiosity sharpened into caution. Finally, Moretti stood. He did not block Dean's path. Very well, he said. You may pass. Dean turned toward the door. Mr. Martin, Moretti added. Dean paused. I wasn't joking about your family, Moretti said quietly. Not really. Waited. I grew up in a house where names were weapons, Moretti continued. Where blood was something men used, not something they honored. When you spoke about yours, you reminded me there is another way men can be made. Dean regarded him for a moment. I hope you find it, he said. Then he opened the door and left down the stairs, back into music, back into smoke and murmurs, and faces pretending nothing had happened. But something had, because upstairs. For the first time in years, Salvatore, Moretti remained standing in a room alone, staring out at a city he had bent in many ways, and realizing that one quiet man had just crossed it without asking permission. And that realization, in Moretti's world, was never without consequences. The trouble did not come loudly. It never did. It arrived the way serious things always arrived in Dean Martin's life, quietly, politely, carrying a familiar voice and an unfamiliar weight. 3 days after the night at the club, when the city had already smoothed itself back into glitter and rumor, Dean was sitting alone on the terrace of his hotel. The desert morning pale and cool, a cup of coffee untouched beside him. He had slept poorly. Not from fear. From awareness, there was a difference. Fear was noise. Awareness was pressure. And since that night, something invisible had been leaning. Gently but persistently against the shape of his days. The phone rang once. Then again, Dean answered on the second ring. Dean, the financier's voice. Not hurried, not calm. Somewhere uncomfortably between. I need to see you. Good morning to you too, Dean said lightly. A pause. This isn't about pleasantries. Then it's about something else, Dean replied. And those usually are. Another pause. Longer this time. He's asking about you. Dean did not need to ask who. People like him always ask, Dean said. They just don't always admit it. This is different, the man said. He's not asking questions. He's moving pieces. Dean leaned back in his chair and watched the early light slide across the distant buildings. Then you should stop letting him use your hands. A breath, tight and frustrated. That's not how this works, and you know it. Dean said. That's how it always works. It just stops working the day someone decides to put his hands back in his own pockets. Dean. I'll meet you, Dean said. Tell me where. They met not in an office, not in a club, not in any place where the architecture already knew how to hide secrets. They met in a public cafe just off the strip, where tourists wandered with maps folded like origami, and waitresses carried plates without noticing names. It was the kind of place men like Moretti would never enter, not because it was unsafe, but because it was uncontrolled. Too many witnesses, too much randomness, too little reverence. The financier arrived early. That alone told Dean enough. He was stirring his coffee even though it had already gone cold, his eyes flicking up every time the door opened, like a man waiting not for someone to arrive, but for something to fall. He sent someone to see me this morning, the financier said as soon as Dean sat. Someone you could describe? Dean asked. No, the man said. And that's the problem. Dean nodded. He didn't threaten, the financier continued. He didn't demand. He congratulated me. On my work, on my discretion, on the quality of my relationships. Dean's mouth curved faintly. That's how men like him clear their throats, he said. The financier went on. That it's rare to meet someone who doesn't immediately start bargaining when they realize whose air they're breathing. He said you interested him. That you complicated a room he was accustomed to controlling. Dean listened. He also said, the man added, that complicated things deserve to be understood. Dean's eyes lifted. And he wants you to do him a favor. The words settled between them. A favor. Dean repeated. Yes. Not a job. No. Not a performance. No. A favor, Dean said again. The financier nodded. He said it would be simple. Public. Harmless. Dean waited. He's hosting a private charity gala next week, the man said. Children's hospital. Cancer wing. All very respectable. He wants you to attend. To sing. To lend your presence. He said the city listens to you in a way it doesn't listen to anyone else.
8.
Dean's fingers rested lightly on the table, and he needs that listening directed somewhere. The financier swallowed. He said it would help. Normalize certain things. Calm certain tensions. There are people who've been asking questions lately. Reporters, civic groups. He wants the evening to remind everyone that he is, above all, a benefactor. Dean looked out the window at a family passing by, the father holding a child's hand too tightly, as if the city might steal her if he loosened his grip. And if I decline? Dean asked. The financier hesitated. Say it, Dean said. He didn't say what would happen, the man admitted. He just said, he prefers conversations to misunderstandings. Dean smiled gently. Every man does. They sat in silence for a moment, the ordinary world moving around them like water around stones. You're not in danger, the financier said quickly. Not like that. He's not that kind of man anymore. Dean's eyes returned to him. There is no any more with men like that. There is only quieter. The financier rubbed his face. Dean, listen to me. You don't owe him anything. But you also don't owe the world martyrdom. One night. A few songs. A smile. You do it, he feels acknowledged, and whatever curiosity he has about you fades. You walk away clean. Dean stirred his coffee once, slowly, watching the dark swirl lighten and disappear. You know, he said there was a time when every man who wanted legitimacy built a church. Then they built hospitals. Then they built museums. It was never about God or healing or art. It was about laundering power until it could sit in polite rooms. The financier's shoulders slumped. That's the world we live in. No, Dean said quietly. It's the world people agree to. He stood. I won't sing at his gala, he said. The financier closed his eyes. I will go, Dean continued. I will attend. I will sit. I will shake hands. I will be respectful. But I won't be used as music to soften questions that deserve voices. The financier opened his eyes. Dean, you don't understand what you're refusing. Understand exactly, Dean replied. I'm refusing to make my voice a curtain. The gala was held in a hall so polished it barely felt human. Crystal hung like frozen rain from the ceiling. Tables glowed under soft white cloth. Men in tailored suits and women in dresses that whispered, when they moved, drifted through the space, carrying flutes of champagne and careful expressions. At one end of the room, banners celebrated generosity. At the other, small stage waited beneath a spotlight that had been rehearsing for someone else. Dean arrived, without spectacle, but spectacle followed him anyway. Eyes turned. Murmurs formed. Smiles rose, practiced and eager. He greeted them all with the same quiet warmth. He shook hands. He listened. He asked about children, about work, about the weather, about anything that anchored conversations to the ordinary. Moretti watched from across the room, still center in a moving painting, when they finally met. It was not announced. It happened the way planets cross paths. Moretti extended his hand. Mr. Martin. Dean took it. Mr. Moretti, I'm glad you came, Moretti said. I was hoping you would. I said I would, Dean replied. I keep my word. Moretti gestured lightly toward the stage. They're expecting you, Dean said. Often expect many things. A flicker of amusement crossed Moretti's face. "You're very consistent." Dean inclined his head. "So I've been told." They stood there, the noise of the room cushioning their quiet. "You won't sing," Moretti said. "It was not a question." "No," Dean replied. Moretti studied him. "That disappoints some people." "It would disappoint me more if I did," Dean said. A pause. Moretti nodded slowly. "Then stay," he said. "Observe. Enjoy the evening. Let people see that we are acquainted." Dean met his gaze. "We are acquainted," he said. "We are not aligned." Moretti smiled. "Sometimes the difference is smaller than men think." "Sometimes," Dean replied. "It's the only thing that matters." They parted. An hour passed. Then, too, speeches were made. Donations were announced. Applause rose and fell on cue. Moretti moved through the room like a host who owned more than the building. Dean remained mostly seated. Speaking when spoken to, his presence steady. His voice warm but unclaimed. Then the interruption came, not from the stage, from the side. A young woman stood near the back of the hall. Her dress simple, her posture uncertain. Her hands clenched around something small and dark. She had not been part of the plan. That was visible immediately. Heads turned. A security man started toward her, then hesitated when he saw what she was holding. A folded photograph. Her voice was not loud, but it was real. "My brother worked for you," she said. Her eyes fixed, not on the crowd, but on Moretti. "He told me to bring this, if anything ever happened to him." The room shifted. Moretti did not move. "He said," the woman continued, her voice trembling but unbroken, "that if I ever needed someone to know who he really was, I should find a place where everyone was pretending." "To be someone else?" A murmur spread like wind. The security man glanced at Moretti's face had not changed. Dean stood, not quickly, but completely. He did not go to the stage. He did not go to Moretti. He walked toward the woman. The room opened around him. Instinctively, he stopped beside her, not in front, not behind, beside. "What's your name?" Dean asked gently. "Clara," she said. "Who is your brother?" Dean asked. Her hand shook as she held out the photograph. His name was Daniel. Dean took it. He did not look at it immediately. He looked at her. "Would you like to sit?" he asked. She nodded. Almost imperceptibly, Dean guided her to a chair. Only then did he look at the photograph. And when he did, the calm in his face deepened into something else. Recognition, because the man in the picture was someone Dean had met once. Years ago, backstage, a stagehand who had thanked him not for the music, but for remembering his name. Dean closed his fingers around the photo, and somewhere across the room, Salvatore Moretti understood for the first time that night that the evening he had designed was no longer his, because Dean Martin had just chosen a side, and he had done it in public. And in that world, public choices were never forgiven quietly. For a moment, the hall forgot how to breathe. Crystal chandeliers glimmered above frozen faces. The orchestra at the far end of the room trailed off into a confused murmur, bows lowering, fingers slipping from keys as musicians sensed something had shifted beyond music. The low murmur of wealth and courtesy that had filled the evening thinned into a fragile silence, the kind that arrives when people realize they are no longer attending an event. But witnessing a decision, Dean remained. Standing beside Clara, he did not raise the photograph. He did not address the crowd. He did not look toward Moretti. He looked only at her. "Tell me about Daniel," he said quietly. The question itself unsettled the room. This was not how interruptions were handled in places like this. They were removed. They were softened. They were guided away and absorbed by architecture. They were not invited to speak. Clara's lips parted, but for a moment no sound came. Then she inhaled, as if drawing courage from the air itself. "He was kind," she said. "That's what everyone said about him. He fixed things. Lights, doors, radios. He was always fixing things." She swallowed. He took this job because he thought it would lead somewhere stable. Something I could point to when people asked what my brother did. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not noise, but discomfort. He stopped calling as much, she continued. When he did, he said he was busy, that things were complicated. He said he was around important people, but that he never felt more invisible. Her fingers tightened. 2 months ago, a man came to our door and told us Daniel had been in an accident, that it was quick, that there was nothing to look into. Her voice did not crack, which was somehow worse. He left this with a neighbor, she said. He said, if anything ever happened, I should go somewhere bright and show it to someone people trust. Dean nodded slowly. He looked down at the photograph again, then he turned, not toward the room. He held the photo up. Not as an accusation, but as an introduction. This is Daniel, Dean said. That was all, not was. Is. This man worked behind stages, Dean continued. He made sure lights turned on, doors opened, people were safe. He did the kinds of jobs that only get noticed when they're not done. He paused. I met him once. Backstage in Chicago, he thanked me for remembering his name. I thanked him for making sure I had a place to stand. Murmurs stirred. He told me he wanted to fix things, Dean went on. Not just wires, not just walls. He wanted to fix whatever made people feel small. Dean's eyes moved slowly across the crowd. If that was his dream, then he belonged to this room long before tonight. The silence deepened. Somewhere near the back, someone set down a glass that had been trembling in their hand. Dean turned slightly back to Clara. Why did he give you this? He asked. She hesitated, then reached into her purse and withdrew a folded envelope. She opened it carefully, as if afraid sound might disturb what was written inside. He wrote that the people he worked around spoke about loyalty, she said. But that loyalty only moved one way? He wrote that the same men who praised generosity were very careful about what questions were allowed near it. Moretti shifted. It was subtle, but Dean saw it, he wrote. Clara continued. That he didn't know if he was in danger. Only that he no longer knew who he was protecting. She lifted her eyes to Dean. He wrote your name, she said. The room exhaled. Dean felt the weight of it settle into his shoulders. Not as burden, but as responsibility. He said you were the only man he'd met in those places who treated him like he mattered even when there was nothing to gain. Dean closed his eyes. Briefly, then he nodded. Double quotes, Daniel fixed things, Dean said. Sometimes that means tightening what's loose. Sometimes it means loosening what's too tight. He looked out again. And sometimes it means refusing to pretend something is fine when it isn't. He lowered the photo. I don't know what happened to Daniel, he said. I don't know who failed him, or how, or why. His gaze lifted and found Moretti's at last. But I know this. When a room built on generosity becomes a place where fear does the accounting, something has gone wrong. Moretti took one slow step forward. Mr. Martin, he said calmly. This is not the time or place for... Dean did not raise his voice. He did not interrupt. He simply continued. This evening was meant to celebrate help, he said. And help is never embarrassed by truth. Moretti stopped. The crowd watched. Some with fascination, some with unease, some with something. Closer to relief, Dean turned back to Clara. What? Would you like people to know? He asked. Her breath trembled, then steadied. I would like them to know that my brother's life did not end in an accident, she said. It ended in a place where he no longer felt allowed to speak. And that silence is what frightened him most. Woman near the front raised a hand to her mouth. Man further back looked down at the floor. Dean nodded once. Then he did something no one expected. He gestured toward the stage. May I borrow your microphone? He asked the nearest attendant. The man hesitated only a fraction of a second before handing it. Overdote Dean took the stage, not as a performer, as a man. He did not center himself beneath the spotlight. He stood slightly to the side, and he did not speak immediately. He let the room come to him. Tonight was supposed to be about generosity, Dean said. So let's speak honestly about it. Generosity is not what you give when the room applauds. It is what you allow to be seen when the room would rather look away. He scanned the faces. Some of you here donate because you believe in causes. Some because you believe in appearances. And some because the two have blurred so long, you no longer know which is which. He paused. I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to remind. He lifted the photograph again. This man mattered, Dean said. Not because of who he worked near, but because of who he was. If our charities do not have room for people like him to speak, then they are not houses of help. They are houses of quiet. The word quiet moved through the crowd like a cold current. I was invited to sing tonight, Dean said, to soften things, to make them easier to applaud. He shook his head gently. But some rooms don't need songs. They need space. He turned and gestured toward Clara. She came here because she believed people would listen. Dean looked back at the room. Prove her right. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, one man near the center rose from his seat. He did not clap. He did not speak. He simply stood, then another chairs. Whispered against the floor. Nod. Applause, acknowledgement, a wave of standing figures moved. Through the hall, not uniform, not coordinated, but unmistakable. Dean felt it, not as triumph, but as gravity, a room choosing what direction it leaned. Moretti remained. Seated, his face unreadable, but something essential had slipped beyond his reach, because power could command silence, but it could not command listening. Dean stepped down from the stage. He returned to. Clara sighed. You don't have to say anything else tonight, he told her. But you won't say it alone. She nodded. Tears finally tracing silent paths down her face. Security did not remove her. They did not remove him. No one did. Gala did not continue. It dissolved. In clusters of conversation, in hushed tones, in exchanged glances, in questions no one had planned to ask later, much later. As Dean and Clara stood near the exit, the city breathing beyond the glass, Moretti approached. The room felt smaller around him now, not diminished. Human, you've made things complicated, he said. Dean met his eyes. Truth usually does. Moretti's jaw tightened. You've drawn attention where I did not invite it. Dean nodded. Attention is not something you can own. Moretti studied him for a long moment. Then, quietly, you think this ends here? Dean shook his head. No, he said. I think it begins where I no longer decide what happens next. Moretti's gaze moved to Clara, then back to Dean. Be careful, Mr. Martin, he said. The world you just stepped into is not as kind as your songs. Dean's voice was gentle. Neither was the one I came from. Moretti said nothing more. He turned and walked away. Outside, the desert air felt cool and real. Clara stood beside Dean, clutching the photograph to her chest. I don't know what happens now, she said. Dean smiled softly. Neither do I, he replied. But I know this. Whatever happens, people heard your brother's name in a room where it wasn't supposed to exist. They walked toward the lights of the street, and behind them, in a hall built for applause, something far rarer had taken place. A room had chosen to listen, and that, long after songs faded, was what truly changed the echo.